And thank you very much, Rob, for that introduction. And it is an absolute pleasure to be with you today for this conference. Just a little bit about the Mitchell Institute, in case you don't know. It's a new institute, and we're nested at Victoria University in Queen Street in the city. And it's a funded institute by Harold Mitchell and the Victoria University. It's a joint venture. And it came about as a real concern about the health and well-being and education of young people, and the need to take a very radical and different policy approach, one that Harold Mitchell, if ever you've read Harold Mitchell's stuff or heard Harold Mitchell, you will know a very successful businessman and incredibly impatient and wanting policy to be moving to support good outcomes for young people. So I have the real pleasure of leading a very small group at the Mitchell Institute on that mission. And like all things, you know, we're not a department, we're only 8 people. So what do we focus on? Where do we want to see our focus for change? And we're really honing in on what kind of capabilities are we trying to build for young people. And we're looking at it through schooling and through tertiary, interestingly enough. So looking at this idea of creative, entrepreneurial, resilient, skilled learners. So we're really honing in on this as what we're going to need in the future. And so my presentation today is really looking at collaboration for what purpose, and I'm really going to hone in on that, on looking at those areas. What I'm really interested in is where do you learn about policy? Where does it happen? And I think what I've learnt from being at Mitchell is that the greatest way of learning about policy is from the ground up. So thinking about where great practice is happening, and I really like the way Minister Molino was saying, learning from within, because it is about learning from where great practice is happening and thinking about, well, what policies are getting in the way of that happening more, that spreading, and what policies seem to be enabling. So at Mitchell, we talk very much about enabling policies to allow great practice to grow and spread. So that's really where we come from a policy. And so at Mitchell, we've been working with groups of schools in New South Wales, in South Australia, and indeed in Victoria, about how we can be learning for change. So that's a little bit about Mitchell. Now, I am going to hit the data, because you would expect me to, from my past role in the department. I do like a little bit of evidence to kick the conversation off. So, and these data that I'm going to put up are what I would call the persistent challenges. It's the persistent fact that we've not changed these stats over quite some time. I'm going to sort of paint the picture of the data. I'm going to paint the picture of the need, and then we're going to hoe in to, well, why would collaboration be an important driver for us? So, persistent challenges. Persistently, 25% of Year 9 students can't read well enough for further learning. So these students are at or below national minimum standard. And if you go to low SES students, that figure rises to 40% of Year 9 students. You go to Indigenous students and it goes up to around about 50%, and similarly for children who are out of home care. 20% of 15-year-olds fail to master the simplest of maths problems. Around 50% of 15-year-olds, this is from the PISA, report not being good at solving maths problems and are not interested in the things that they're learning in maths. Why pick on maths? It's a really important area for how young people think about themselves as learners. So if you're not good at some of these things, it carries over to be saying to yourself, I'm actually not a good learner. So I highlight these for very important reasons. Nearly 40% of 15-year-olds say that students in their class don't listen. Less than 30% of secondary students find learning at school stimulating. 40% of 15-year-olds report family demands or other problems are preventing them from putting time into their work. 25% have mental health issues, and by the time we get to 17 to 25-year-olds, we're finding a quarter are actually not engaged in education, training or work. So these are persistent, and it is clear that schools on their own are not going to be able to nudge these figures. So one of the rationale for thinking differently about how schools are networked into their community is indeed these persistent figures. The consequence of these is a widening gap in life chances between those who have had educational opportunities and to develop skills and those who don't. And student engagement is a growing concern. It's a growing issue internationally. So we're really squandering what is possible for a whole group of students. And I would also potentially argue, if I had statistics on the top end, we would see we're possibly not stretching the brightest as well. I'm throwing this in because it's a really important fact that we're dealing with very wide in-school variation based, if we just take one indicator, socioeconomic backgrounds, and we look at these 15-year-olds, we can see we've got a huge variation. And I circle the government school bar there to show that not only have we got huge variation, but government schools are serving the lowest or the most disadvantaged students in the state. So with this high variation and this performance gap, at any year level that you could possibly look at, you've got potentially between 5 and 8 years of learning diversity. And you know yourselves, for any year 7 cohort that you have an intake, you've got students that will be reading at year 3, you've got students that will be reading at year 9. And yet, we still struggle to have these students in classrooms, in subjects, expecting that they will learn at similar rates to others. Students, in many ways, students from the poorest backgrounds and from the lowest starting point are probably not going to be able to catch up. What we want to offer is a diversity and build the talents that they have. So we've got the persistent problems, we've got this huge variation that plays out in every classroom in our schools. But we've also got some persistent strengths. And I really want to play to these persistent strengths through the rest of my presentation, because it's a strengths-based approach that I believe we truly need in our reform. So more than 90% of kids are reporting a really positive teacher-student relationship. And everybody you talk to about schooling will say that is the thing that makes the difference. Harold Mitchell himself, I don't know whether you know his story, he left school when he was about 14 or 15, and he talks about the teachers that made a difference in his life. He was from a very poor background, was at Stawell, went through a school, and he said it was the teachers that helped me with the belief in myself and the talents that they showed me. And of course, he's gone on to be an amazing entrepreneur and a successful business. Now, not everybody's going to be like Harold Mitchell, but it's about playing to your strengths and to the talents that you have. Students say that, trying hard's important to them. They want to do well at school, they're motivated to do well. And they say that school has helped them to have confidence and to help make decisions. And indeed, 95% report that their parents believe it's important for me to study maths. So again, this comes through the PISA work. And what's interesting about each of those stats is that there is no socioeconomic difference. So if you cut that by different backgrounds, there is no difference in those aspirations from the students. So that's kind of the context that we've got. So we've got highly motivated, kids who enter and want to do really well, and yet we've got this kind of counter balance where there's kind of, it's not quite hitting the mark for many of those young people. So Catherine Livingstone from the Business Council of Australia, and the Business Council has been quite vocal recently in saying that the forces shaping our world are very different from that we've experienced before. They require different responses from government, from business, and indeed from us as individuals. The social and economic inequality, combined with growing competition between individual schools, are going to overwhelm any gain that we can make in quality of teaching and learning. So, pursuing individual school autonomy, if we ignore the other systemic forces, may force with us a reductionist focus. And indeed, it may take us to a more narrow view of classroom practice. We've seen that attempt happen if we pursue individual school performance, we pursue individual teacher performance and individual principal performance, we can actually see potentially a reductionist. Now, I'm not shying away from the fact we should all have some kind of feedback on how we're going, but if we keep doing it on this individual basis, we do run the risk of reducing what's possible instead of expanding what's possible. So we do need to continue to do some things well, but we do need to do more that is different. The future really paints quite an interesting picture for young people. So if you're a 22-year-old, and many of you might have seen the Foundation for Young Australian report, which was really very impressive. Somewhat pessimistic, I felt at times, but it is a really good reminder that if you are a 22-year-old, over the next working life, you're not just going to have one job, you're going to have many, and you'll have to be able to train, retrain, relearn all the way through. And up until the global financial crisis, you could have been a 15-year-old with no skills and get a job in a factory, on a farm or in a warehouse. But now, where do barely skilled people get jobs? If these are not only shedding labour, but a lot of these are automating. So we will find that in the next couple of decades, it's moving really, really rapidly, a number of jobs that exist today will not exist. And the modelling that's been done would suggest that about 5 million Australian jobs, around 40% of the workforce, will face a high probability of being replaced by computers in the next 10 to 15 years. So in thinking about those young people who've barely got those skills that we talked about at the outset, what happens to them? And the consequence is really quite profound in terms of we would see disaffection, social unrest, and indeed a different kind of inequality occurring. So the main attributes that people talk about for the future worker are this flexibility, fluidity, agility, and I would argue that that is ever present for us in our workplaces as it is for our future. So the question is, how are we preparing young people for this different kind of future? Are we preparing them to be adaptable, confident, creative, successful learners? So the three areas that in Mitchell would say as the three game changers are creativity, collaboration, and data evidence and judgment. So I'm going to take you through each of these and why they matter and why they're the game changers. And then I'm going to look at how do these all come together for our work in secondary schools. So again, going back to the Business Council, and they would argue that the capacity of individuals to create and innovate will be the difference for success and failures in companies. How we educate, train and retrain is going to be the game changer in keeping countries and the people within them productive, competitive and prosperous. And so what we're seeing is a rise in Australia of a knowledge-based economy, a service economy. So people with those knowledge-based skills and also service skills are going to be where our future economy lies. And in Victoria, you'll notice that with the changing economy, the decline of manufacturing in Victoria, it's really pushing very strongly into the kind of key industries, food, health sciences, logistics, internationalisation of education and so on. So our future economy is going to be dependent on these industries, and the other one of course is creative industries. So thinking about that, how do we prepare our students? We work very closely with Professor Yong Zhao, and many of you will have heard Yong. So he is a professorial fellow at Mitchell Institute, and he argues that creative resilience, entrepreneurial skills and global competencies are the future currency for student learning. And again, about how globalisation has transformed industry, changed jobs, demanding a different kind of skill set. He is way more provocative than I will ever be, and what Yong would say is that we're too busy on trying to fix the past system rather than inventing the future. I think I'm more with Simon on the fact that we've got to be able to go a little more from where we are to rather than throw everything up in the air. We have to invest in inventing the future, but we need to do that in a very systematic, well thought through and focused way, which I hope to sort of take you through. The latest report from CEDA, the Centre for Economic Development in Australia, was saying that what's really important in this kind of world is that we're instilling the development of capabilities as opposed to the retention of specific knowledge. So knowledge can be learnt anytime, anywhere, and there are certain things that you do have to scaffold. And I think mathematics is a clear one that we need to scaffold. You can't just lob in at mathematics without having had the foundations. But it's the capabilities, it's what you do with that knowledge, how you use it, how you interpret it, is the critical piece. And I think the shift towards a more capability-driven framework is one that we all need to start paying serious attention to. It's there in curriculum frameworks, but we generally don't know much about how to assess it, and we don't know about actually how students learn and grow a lot in that area. So in a world that is rapidly changing, a predetermined set of standardised knowledge and skills through a set curriculum are not going to be the best bets for jobs into the future. So Bill Lucas, who many of you will also know, is a strategic advisor for Mitchell as well in this area of work. And he argues that it has to change, and I would absolutely recommend, if you haven't read it, read his new book called Educating Ruby. It's a really great read, and indeed I would go as far as to say that if you've got parents who are resistant or not understanding changes, you're trying to get all your parents reading Education Ruby as well. It's a great read, and it's really grounded from a child's perspective and from a parent's perspective. And he's also saying that, look, you know, there's a lot going on for young people, and to help them thrive, we do need to look at the mental, emotional and social capabilities, the habits of mind, as he would call it. So both of his books are terrific. And of course, Young's book is World Class Learners, lays out a very nice framework for this as well. So when I think about, you know, both of these, I can't help but sort of think about some young people that I've seen recently in schools. And there was one young boy who arrived at secondary school, and he really did struggle to read. And I think by definition he was considered to be dyslexic, but he was really struggling to read. And this particular school has really worked on, well, what strengths does this child have? What talents, what passions does this young person have? And this particular young boy is particularly good at designing computer games. Surprise, surprise. There are many young men very good at designing computer games, and very many young women that are very good at designing computer games. Well, he's actually been encouraged to do that. His learning has been crafted around this particular talent, and now he's been offered traineeships with Cisco. It's an amazing story of building talent. Had he been in a school where he was seeing probably that reading was a problem, he may well have gone down a different spiral. So what I'm thinking is, how do we tap into the talents and diversity of young people and use that strength-based approach to grow learning confidence, whereby they can circle back and develop their literacy and their numeracy. I think too often we might be starting at the problem, and so young people then lose their learning confidence, and then it becomes very hard to engage at a later stage. So early engagement, maximise individual difference, value the variation and diversity of the students you have and the diverse talents. So my first question to all of you will be, to what extent Think about one teacher in your school and one class that they have. To what extent would that teacher know what that child is really good at, what their passions are, what their interests are? So my goal would be that every teacher would know that about every child. What's their passion? What are they good at? And what's going to really click for them in terms of learning? And then the next challenge would be, how do we scaffold then our learning around that diverse and build that diverse talents? What we don't need more of is a lot of children learning the same thing. What we will need into the future is a diversity of talented individuals. We can't all be good at maths, we can't all be good at writing, we can't all be good at music, we can't all be good at sport. Every child will have something that they're really good at, and to think about how we spark that in our secondary schools so that that learning pathway, that deep learning around things that they're really good at and that they develop very deep knowledge can really kick in. So the second game changer is collaboration. And so this is work we did, as Simon mentioned, with Tom Bentley and I can blank on the name, Sian Kazali, the shared work of learning, and we worked across 3 jurisdictions. So this collaboration, it is not, when people talk collaboration, everybody goes a bit fluffy and goes, oh, collaboration, oh, that's nice. Everybody's sitting around. It is not collaboration, everybody doing the same thing. It is collaboration for a purpose. It's students collaborating with each other. It's students with teachers. It's teachers with teachers. It's schools with schools. It's schools with families. It's schools with industry, business, health, community services. It's actually about setting up a way of thinking that is a learning system as opposed to a learning institution. So if we go back to thinking about diversity of talent, diversity of opportunity, it is going to be impossible, I would suggest, to do that totally within the institutional boundary. It will need diverse pathways for students and for teachers to be learning and growing. So we need to strengthen these local learning systems, and this is where autonomy absolutely needs to be at the fore. So locally led decision making, focusing on capabilities and knowledge. So this is where the purposeful comes in, purposefully focusing on capabilities and knowledge. So a really shared work of learning, the shared vision of learning, and develop those wider relationships to support that learning outcomes. And particularly as our economies are changing and our communities are changing. This kind of learning system then becomes adaptable to student needs. So if a student can't get access to types of learning in one school, they can work across schools, and this is happening. So the good news, this work is happening. What we're saying is we've got to strengthen it and grow it. And again, this learning within the system is critical for that. And I do believe that this local learning system must have responsibility for all students' learning. I think it is unacceptable that some students are not able to access the learning and get moved from one school to another. And I'm not saying that there are many students with incredibly challenging behaviours, and I think this is part of the need for a greater collaboration where students can remain connected to a pathway that they value, developing their talents. So collaboration with business, I think, is proving to be incredibly interesting, and I hope my friends from Gippsland don't mind me highlighting. They've got a collaboration going with Murray Goulburn. And what's been really interesting, Murray Goulburn being the big dairy company, what's interesting there is about how the science teachers at the schools in this Gippsland initiative have been working with the scientists at the Murray Goulburn in their factory. And what's been interesting is learning about how science is actually working both with industry and how that can be made real in schools. Similarly, Murray Goulburn have got a whole interesting way of thinking about, well, what are the other issues that school students could also engage with? Real problems that are facing a very big industry, which of course is a huge part of Gippsland. And so they're working together with students on some learning problems and learning ideas. This is not easy work, it's quite challenging work, and we're literally dipping our toe in the water, and it's being led by the principals at Gippsland. But it's quite a powerful shift in thinking about how people come together on real issues that matter to that community, that students are part of the problem solving and learning. What's interesting also about that is once you move into that mode, the parents also become incredibly engaged and involved, because this is a learning that is relevant to the community. So my third piece is data, evidence and judgment. And I don't know whether any of you went to the Michael Barber lecture, the Joy and Data. I've always thought joy and data went together, but a lot of people didn't. But the problem with data has that we've really been using it, as I said, to judge performance, and in some cases, you know, it has been used in the past in quite a negative way. But data has the capacity to really match what every student needs. You know, whether it's an additional stimulus or added support, that each child can find joy in learning and flourish and tackle life's opportunity. And it's that last paragraph that I think the data piece around teacher judgment is so critical, and I'll come back to that. The second piece on data is about how we have feedback-rich environments, so that everything we're doing is noticed, it's fed back to the student notices, and it's fed back, and I'll come back to this as well. But Larry Kaminer, who many of you would know from BCG, he's intrigued with how absent regular feedback is in the school sector. And he said it's in most other companies they would have feedback, and he says in sport people constantly get feedback. This is the cornerstone of how people develop, and he argues it's almost absent in many parts of the school sector, but it needn't be. So let's have a look at how do you bring all of this together. So how do we bring all of this together? What might this look like if you bring creativity, collaboration, data and evidence and judgment together? So I think the first thing that it looks like is, and I'm going to go through these key areas for action. One is, I think we've really got to give visibility to learning outcomes that are diverse and valued in our school. And we have to pay more than lip service to them. They have to be up there in lights. And maybe they are buzzwords, I don't know. But I think we must say that, you know, learning how to learn, developing learning skills, we know that's going to be important. Creativity, critical thinking, curiosity. You heard the Google CEO talk about that. communication, collaboration, perseverance, resilience, adaptability, empathy, concepts, knowledge, skills. So, it's not that we're going to be able to do all of this at once, but think about what would resonate well in your school. Where would you start if you were thinking that this needed to be more visible in your school? Now, I'm not saying that NAPLAN and literacy and all of those, literacy, numeracy, don't matter. Of course they matter. They provide very useful markers and pointers. But if all we're doing is trying to get more and more readers in the top bands of NAPLAN, I'm just not quite sure what edge that gives any child. I think everybody needs to have the foundations of reading, but I'm not sure by getting more and more in the top bands it's going to be different. And similarly, foundations with maths. Does everybody have to be a high achiever in maths? No. So what are the foundations, and can we be sure that we've got those? But let's really push on these other capabilities and have learning that helps young people to thrive with developing these other capabilities that are not only needed now, they'll be needed in the future. And they're not only for learning, they're for well-being. So yourselves, if you imagine or remember, things that you really love doing and that you're really your passion projects. When you're doing your passion projects, you feel really good about that. And it's the same for students learning. Get them engaged in things that they're really good at, that they can thrive at. My hypothesis, I don't have the evidence, but this is part of our research, is that the well-being issues can largely take care of themselves too. So economists are saying very clearly that the people skills is as vital in life as any academic test. And what we now know is that these foundational skills have lifelong benefits. The economists have talked about the return on investment of developing these early skills. And a lot of young children who come from families where these skills are not part of the milieu that they're in, really do miss out on developing these kind of capabilities. The OECD released a report talking about the need for balance of this cognitive, social and emotional to succeed. And this is really talking about they complement cognitive skills. They're important drivers of social outcomes. So if we think about, well, what's the purpose of education? These outcomes are equally important as the cognitive outcomes, and we need to privilege them in our learning. So how do we get to that kind of learning? It's a co-design process. So a co-design, real-world learning driven by students' passions and interests, connecting with community, connecting with industry. It cannot be done all at once, and many of you will be doing this at particular year levels through passion, through project-driven type work. The key elements of this, though, is, and this is happening if you look at high-tech high studios in the US, studio schools in the UK, Summerhill School. We've got schools across Victoria and across Australia moving in this direction. These projects can be designed with businesses, with community, and it can really bring learning to life for the students, for the community, for parents, because parents will come in droves to watch the students present real products, real things to real audiences. So it's product orientation. It engages students in deep learning through the creation of these authentic products, identifying the problem or need, thinking of solutions, making and trying prototypes, getting feedback on that, refining their design, presenting results, getting feedback, and so on. The final product serves a genuine purpose. It solves a real problem and meets a genuine need of others and is personally meaningful. It requires sustained, disciplined efforts, persistence that applied over a long time. It requires failing, actually getting it wrong and redoing the piece of work. This is real-world learning. So can I contrast this with a piece of learning that a student might do, an essay, say, where they hand it in. Let's think about a Year 8 class. They hand it in. The teacher would have, I don't know how many of these essays that are handed in. They will correct that essay and give feedback on that essay, and that piece of work is then completed and they move on to the next piece of work. I don't know to what extent you would ever ask that student to redraft. There would be a drafting process, but to what extent you draft, redraft, and who is the audience for that piece of work. So what many students do is they know what's going to get them the grade, or they know what they need to do to get by. And so they play that game of, this is what I have to do to get by, and this is how I get the grades, and I keep marching on. Some kids won't play that game, and they're the ones that, just don't hand in the work, or they don't complete the tasks. So again, I'm thinking less is more here, and there's a lovely phrase where going slower is going faster. So thinking about really what learning are we trying to achieve here, and taking time over that learning so that by the time it gets to the product, that student is incredibly proud. They've worked collaboratively to deliver something. And in fact, with the Murray Goulburn Gippsland schools, the students are actually going to present to the board of Murray Goulburn, or one group of students are going to do that, another will present to the community. So it's a very different learning model. It's a really messy learning model. It's not linear, and I just had to have a look online. I was trying to find some idea of what a learning model looked like. And we were playing with this with the Murray Goulburn team, and we said, well, actually, it's lots of rapid prototypes. So where did the ideas come from for the project? And then what opportunities have we got? How do we generate the concept and ideas? How do we then start to refine? Have we got the right idea? What's the feedback loop? So you've got massive feedback loops, and you can see all the way through here, it inspires deep thinking about what you're doing, how you're developing it, and the kind of feedback that you get, until you get through to the end, which is a launch or a release or a production or and what you have is multiple talents at play here. So you'll have students who are really good at the stats and being able to do the real research background. You'll have others who are really good at the presentation, the media skills, the way that it's laid out. You'll have some kids really good at doing video recording and getting interviews and capturing. You'll have others that are very good at writing. And so you're trying to really build on that diversity of talent to generate a co-designed learning model. And again, business, it's done with other adults, it's done, the ideas just spark about what learning is possible, and you get that interest and drive. And to me, I think this is an incredibly powerful model that secondary schools are working towards. And if this is affirming what you already are doing, go for it. I think this is where we need to be doing so much more. And I don't necessarily think it's in conflict with when you get to VCE, because what you're doing here is getting deep learning in particular areas which students will carry through as they go into further studies. It's not the only way that learning occurs. So with maths, for example, it is more structured, but for other areas, this can be a very, very useful model. But what happens is when you have numeracy applied to this, it's interesting, those kids that may have struggled suddenly get engaged with the learning of maths and literacy. So it's increasing the opportunities for purposeful collaboration. So let's just recap. The first one was really setting visible learning goals, visible learning outcomes that are diverse and valued, co-design the learning opportunity and the real-world learning, but driven by students' passions. And now we're then increasing the opportunity for that purposeful collaboration. Teachers working together within and across organisational and geographical boundaries around these particular learning models. Encouraging study groups or inquiry circles so they are learning from what they're doing, gathering the evidence, refining, prototyping and renewing. So again, professionals working to learn and grow. Professionals from different fields working together, and this again the example of the Murray-Goulburn where professionals are working with professionals in industry. Working with your community assets, the strengths in your community, the businesses in your community that you can build with. Students working together, ideas generation, problem solving. It is imperative that we create that time for professional collaboration, learning and feedback. Without that, teachers do remain isolated and they're not able to kind of learn how to grow and develop their own practice. And again, it is moving slower to go faster. Build that collective capacity of the workforce, learn together on the job, evaluating and improving. So that purposeful professional collaboration around new models of learning focused on students' passions and interest is incredible. So to do that, you have to create the feedback-rich environment. So this is our fourth action. And the feedback-rich environment can only occur when the relationships are very, very strong. And Simon highlighted that earlier. The relationships between teacher and students are central. Going back to our 15-year-olds, they say this is really good. Let's capitalise on it, and let's capitalise on how students get feedback from teachers and teachers get feedback from students. It's a growth mindset, knowing how young people are developing their capabilities and knowledge and skills. It's a strength-based growth mindset, noticing the progress. Feedback occurs regularly, there are rapid feedback loops, and they are absolutely necessary for learning and improvement to occur. So without time for getting feedback for the student, for the teacher, and the school as a whole, you cannot grow. So expansive educators, so those who are seeing this more expanded version for the learning, see it as part of their job to make evaluation an everyday part of their role. And John Hattie, for those of you who would say, know thy impact. Evaluation is about knowing the impact that you're having. So my question here is, how can we expand the noticing capacity of teachers and students to grow and develop diverse capabilities? So not all data has to be quantitative data. The most important data, in my view, is the professional noticing the professional judgment of teachers. And I think we really need to elevate that as being the most significant professional. You can use the other quantitative data to give you a point in time, but every day, in every classroom, what are you noticing about the changes that are happening for students as a result of the type of learning that's occurring? Are you noticing that a child is more persistent at a task? Are you noticing that a child actually has refreshed a piece of work that they previously hadn't done? Have you noticed that they were asking questions that they previously hadn't done? So what kind of observations are teachers making? And I would argue that that needs to be very, very systematic. So just unpacking that multiple source of data that are needed. So learning assessment data, critical, but what type of learning? Teacher observation data, critical, what type of observation? And student perception data. So let me just quickly go through these. Learning assessment data is all about the progress or growth. And what do you know about the non-cognitive skill development of young people in your schools? What do you know as individual teachers about the progress that young people are making across learning areas? And when I've spoken to different schools about this, many teachers in many classrooms don't actually know that gain work. So it's really going right to the granular and thinking about what development is occurring, what evidence do we have, and more importantly, or most importantly, what does the student know about their progress and growth in both cognitive and non-cognitive domains? The student observation data I've spoken a bit about just before, noticing. What might help you notice whether improvements are being made? And these are the questions here. And what might students say you should notice? So how are students part of this evaluation of their own growth and development? But I would argue that this is the area where we do need to be focused, systematic, and evidence-informed. So if I was to start with this, I would start with one teacher, one class, and one area, and to really hone these noticing abilities. If you're working on creative problem solving in your school, what would you expect to see with creative problem solving? And then how do you notice that? And what would students notice if they were doing this as well? So it's a really different kind of dialogue that's occurring around assessment and noticing and data. And finally, I think student perception data is absolutely critical for us to use as part of our feedback loops. Students know effective teaching when they experience it. They provide valuable feedback to teachers, they identify strengths and weaknesses, and they can help to develop new effective teaching strategies. These are reliable measures of teacher effectiveness, and they're most useful when they're used at the classroom level. And again, I would get one class, one teacher, one area, and have this purposeful student perception data around teaching and learning. So the example that I've got here is the tripod survey. Have many of you used the tripod survey or know the tripod survey? I like it because of its constructs are so consistent with what we're talking about in terms of diversity, challenge, creativity, interest, and this helps to feed back to a teacher those dimensions of the classroom. I believe this is available free but I don't know the systems that it operates off. It's grounded on a great deal of educational research, and it captures what many have suggested is the most important features in determining how well students learn. So care, control, clarify, challenge, captivate, confer and consolidate. I really like those dimensions of this feedback to teachers. So that feedback, of course, needs to be timely, and it needs to occur on focus on the progress and effort, build the capability as learners, and strengthen the learning partnership between teachers and students. So just to summarise then, really we're talking about creating a learning system where learning power is boosted. The learning goals are visible. It emphasises and is built on the strengths and interests of each student. It's built on the interests and talents of your teachers. It's built on the resources that you've got in your families and your local community. The students are pursuing passions and learning interests that are important. Parents and families and business and educator providers are engaged in a co-design of some of these key areas. There is a global connection, and many of your schools do that. And there is a strong culture of professional collaboration. And in doing this with our rich feedback cycles, there is a collective understanding of quality. So you're building your own evidence base around what is quality based on your own data, your own noticing, and the evidence that you've gathered. This is actually what builds a strong sense of collective efficacy and impact in a school culture and a school environment. So these are the kind of essential ingredients for that learning, boosting that learning power. So thinking about, and you'll notice here that this is actually all focused about learning, not about teaching. So that's a kind of subtle shift. Teachers are incredibly important, but they're learners as well. So this whole paradigm here is about learning. So the next great education system, so if our minister were here today, it is about valuing diverse system outcomes. And I do think that's been a real weakness, is that we've been quite narrow in some of our outcomes. They've been focused on ATAR, they've been focused on literacy and numeracy. So this is broadening, that all students are learning and progress along a pathway that they value, not a pathway that they're told to go through. Broad, flexible educational experiences, many-to-many relationships. So again, going back to how you're nesting schools with other schools, with business, to create those better outcomes. It absolutely builds on the strengths and unique contexts of all of your schools. So the Murray-Goulburn example is one that is so fit for Gippsland because of the industry there. There will be other great fits for different parts of the state. The resources are directed to learning need at all levels. So not just to the school, but how your resources are being allocated to where the need is at your school. And indeed, we have system-wide cycles of learning from innovation. So how are we learning as schools do embrace a new model, a new increasing model of student-led learning in secondary schools. Like really good learners, we need to get to work and build what we already know, set our goals, evaluate our progress, be optimistic, and I guess we have to persist to accept the unexpected. We must look to the future and prepare all young people for the journey ahead. This is a creative, collaborative and evidence-informed enterprise. It does require us to build new capabilities out of what parts of the system already know and can do. So, as I said at the outset, the good news that this work is already happening. The challenge for us is to make it count for every student and grow the strengths and talents of every student. Thank you.